followed up by Heather Whiteside, who teaches political science at the University of Waterloo and is one of our most important analysts of the P3 structures in Canada. Also from Manitoba,
yes.
And we shared a common professor at some point in time. The most recent book is Public-Private Partnerships. Heather doesn't have an essay in the book, but she has been one of the most important commentators on the P3 of infrastructure in Canada and the roles of the pension funds, and so she was invited to kind of add that dimension, which is so fundamental, so fundamentally a part of this book. Heather.
So thanks so much. As Greg mentioned, I'm not a contributor to the book, but I'm very appreciative to have been invited here, and thanks audience. Looking forward to your comments, questions, what have you. So as has been mentioned, I do research on public-private partnerships. I'm interested in privatization generally, how and why public services are turned into private commodities and sites for capital investment. I'm also interested in doing research on financialization. This word has been used several times. It's really important in this book, which is essentially how and why financial market motives, calculations, and actors have come to increasingly dominate economic decisions, everyday life, the public sector, et cetera. And so sort of just to be honest, I didn't start off this research on privatization and financialization intending to do anything whatsoever to do with pension funds. Very sadly, our pensions, though, are a big part of the privatization and financialization story in Canada, as of course it is elsewhere, but in Canada in particular, and particularly when it comes to P3s, public-private partnerships. Pension funds, like just to name two, OMERS and teachers, have been involved in financing P3s since the earliest days of the P3 phenomenon in Canada. So this isn't just a kind of recent phenomenon, but since the 1990s at least. So these are provincial hospitals, schools, bridges, highways, etc. And now these same pension funds, along with, as we've been hearing about, other giants like the CPPIB, are being openly courted by the Trudeau Liberals to finance and to help finance the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So there's some public sort of taxpayer funds, and those funds are being used to kind of lure other investment through pension funds. So while I'm very thankful to have been invited here, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book, I wish that it wasn't to talk about this overly friendly relationship that we see between pensions and privatization. But they are so intertwined, and they have been for decades. So finance in academic literature is often likened to the circulatory system of capitalism. And this metaphor is shared by theorists on the left and the right. And a really powerful example of this was provided in the credit crunch after the 2008 financial crisis. And this shows just how important this sort of, one very painful episode, how important finance is to the capitalist system. Some people liken the credit crunch to like a cardiac arrest, right? That sort of affected the entire system when this bloodstream dried up, or whatever, to extend the bodily metaphor. Pension funds might represent, and obviously are to some extent, workers' pooled savings, but they are quite clearly integral to this these financial flows, this circulatory system within capitalism. And where are these funds flowing? Well, as I said, I'm sorry to say that they're flowing straight into public-private partnership deals, and they're seeking profitable investments along the way. So P3s are financed through a combination of debt and equity. The equity is the private partner that forms the P3. And pension funds are seldom, if ever in Canada, interested in providing the debt financing. So they aren't interested in being creditors in the debt portion. Instead, what pension funds are doing are teaming up with other members of the P3 industry, those that form private partners. And they're teaming up with companies like the disgraced engineering and construction giant SNC-Lavalin, and the now bankrupt facility service provider Carillion. And as the private partner, pension funds then are holding equity in these P3 arrangements, and what that means is they hold ownership stakes in the management, direction, and overall operation of the P3 public infrastructure, like, as I said, schools, highways, hospitals, bridges, transit, et cetera, the list goes on. And so then pension funds, as the equity holder, make more money when workers make less money. And they make more money when tolls and user fees go up. They make more money when standards go down, and they make more money when government pays more. So squeezing public infrastructure and services for all they're worth makes good on pension managers' fiduciary responsibility. Strictures that are clearly laid out by Simon Archer in Chapter 7, but this process obviously makes us all worse off along the way. So as we've been hearing, and as you can see, the title of the book speaks to contradictions of pension fund capitalism. And the clear contradiction when it comes to treating workers' pooled savings as financial instruments, of treating public infrastructure as an asset and investment site worthy of profit maximization, is that pension funds are prospering through pension members' immiseration. And this is clearly a contradictory moment when the health of workers' savings are tied up with the loss or privatization of their jobs and of our public services. So the book, The Contradictions of Pension Fund Capitalism, does an excellent job of asking us to not be naive about what's happened to our pensions and how pension funds have almost radically transformed through the process of financialization. And in Chapter 6, and Kevin mentioned this a little bit here today, Kevin describes how industry insiders have really singled out our pension funds, our Canadian pension funds, calling them maple revolutionaries. And what do they mean by revolutionary? Well, it's not, revolutionary doesn't have the positive connotation.
Not the one we want.
Right, yeah, exactly, for what folks in this room might hope for. Canadian public and union pension funds are singled out in this sort of infrastructure P3 sort of industry literature as really standing out for the past 10 years at least, if not 15 years, as being aggressive and proliferate with their investments, global investments, as we've been hearing, in fixed capital. And so this is in public and private works within the existing built environment. So not necessarily new builds, but legacy assets like hydroelectric grids, sports stadia, toll roads, that type of thing. And in Australia, just to kind of make mention of another country where this is quite significant, these now massive, they have these massive privatized, long since privatized superannuation funds. They are sort of the originators of pushing new policy around legacy assets, around existing infrastructure. And it's called asset recycling. It's where government turns these existing public works, public infrastructure, stuff that was generally built during the post-war era, if not even earlier, into essentially no-risk income streams for investors. And they sell it off, and then they use that money to buy, or to sort of pay for, to leverage new P3s. So they're selling off our existing public infrastructure to pay for new P3 infrastructure. And this is coming to Canada too, or it's already here. We see some examples, like the Hydro One sale, for instance. But it will soon be institutionalized through the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And I'll come back to the Canada Infrastructure Bank in a moment. Just to return to the book for a second, I want to echo and reinforce what the editors write in the introduction. Pension fund activities in international financial markets and infrastructure procurement are producing outcomes that are detrimental to workers' interests. These pension fund managers are demanding profit, and they're not, as we've been hearing, particularly sentimental when it comes to why and where infrastructure is needed, only that it provides an adequate vehicle for returns on capital invested. So these pension funds then have long since turned away from national development interests, and they're turning towards these global capital markets and investor interests. Staff now come from Wall Street investment banks and private equity firms, and the CPPIB has offices in Toronto, London, and Hong Kong. So these are really privatized, globalized financial investments and agents. And pension funds are not all on the offensive here. So they're also reacting to changes in macroeconomic policy, specifically in monetary policy, i.e. interest rates. Pension funds have become reliant on financial market investments. And this is pointed out initially on page 3, if anyone has the book at hand, where it describes how in the early 1980s, under the guise of inflation fighting, central banks ratcheted up interest rates to double-digit levels. I'm sure everyone remembers this painful experience. And this obviously hurt borrowers, but it tremendously helped creditors. It also, to whatever extent this was going on, it helped sustain a public bond tradition, if public bonds were being floated. But things have changed. In the post-2008 context, we see rock bottom interest rates, historically low interest rates for a very long time. And this is pushing infrastructure financialization because there isn't much money to be made off of sovereign bonds anymore. And many pension funds used to invest in sovereign bonds. But now they can invest in public-private partnerships as equity investors and make 10, 11, 12% return on investment, far above prime rates, which are sort of these single-digit rates. I won't even go into, they can make much more money if the P3 is refinanced and so on. But anyway, so 10, 11, 12% is fairly, fairly regular. But to return to the theme that others have mentioned, as much as pension funds are reacting, as Kevin writes in chapter 6, this is a quote, Canadian pension funds are agents of infrastructure financialization. And this is a self-defeating strategy, to quote Kevin and Sam in the conclusion of the book, because public pension funds and union pension funds in particular are investing in their own demise, as I've been hoping that I've been making clear through this talk.
Yes.
But there is a hopeful note here too, and I really liked the strategy that they laid out for the universal pension plan, which, as they put it, is a sort of strategy to retire with dignity. And when I was reading this, I was amazed. I think it sounds very doable, very dignified, and it had me asking myself whether there are dignified options for linking public services, public infrastructure to pension money. So what strategies might be available to finance infrastructure through pension funds that don't resort to financialization and privatization? So what can be done? Here's where I'd like to bring back into the conversation the Canada Infrastructure Bank. In February 2016, the federal government hired an investment banker from Bank of America Merrill Lynch to assist with the design of the Canada Infrastructure Bank and to advise the infrastructure minister along the way. That advisor was also responsible for encouraging Canada's largest pension funds to invest in capitalizing the bank. And then high-level meetings were held with Canada's big pension funds, behind closed doors, of course, in November 2016. And former president and CEO of the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan was appointed as a special advisor in February 2017. As I mentioned, pension funds want equity. They don't want to be sort of piggy banks funding the debt. They want to hold these infrastructure assets that are safe, predictable, long-run, relatively high-yield investments, and public infrastructure fits very well with that ambition. And on the other side, the federal government clearly wants pension funds money. So the Trudeau Liberals are hungry for this capital, and this might offer some more promise than it would otherwise appear. Instead of using asset recycling through the privatization of what could very well be the privatization of federal airports and ports and other assets owned by the federal government, instead of setting up P3s as investment vehicles, the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a crown corporation. As an arm's length crown corporation, it can float bonds that pension funds can invest in. So essentially this would give pension funds some return. It would give Canadians greater access to capital for infrastructure. And what it would also do, as being just a sort of traditional bond, is it would cut out this long-run privatization of the service component that's particularly troublesome with P3s. Or the federal government, aside from the Canada Infrastructure Bank, could issue revenue bonds. These are bonds that link revenue streams, like tolls on the 407, let's say, though they may be loathed. This could be linked to something like subsidizing public transit. And it would be another kind of vehicle that pension funds could invest in. So basically giving pensions something that isn't a public-private partnership, that doesn't cede control from the public sector, but does help fund retirement, could be, these aren't radical solutions, but there may be a dignified solution, to use that terminology, and they would certainly work or could work alongside more progressive strategies, like obviously more equitable forms of income tax, a wealth tax, Corbyn's proposal of people's quantitative easing, etc. So none of these, even some of those more progressive examples, would entirely eliminate the contradictions of pension fund capitalism, as is evidenced through this book. Pension funds would remain private capital investors and major institutional investors within private financial markets. But if finance is the circulatory system of capitalism, at least we could take steps towards redirecting the flow of workers' savings from profiting off of privatization to really prospering through more sort of healthy and stable investments in public service and public infrastructure rejuvenation.
Thank you.